Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the webinar on Land Matters, Exploring Tenure Solutions for Sustainable Development in Asia. Discussions surrounding land tenure are often avoided due to the sensitive socio-political nature of the topic. Still, secure land tenure is essential for sustainable soil and land management, agricultural productivity, rural development, and social stability. The webinar is organized as part of the implementation strategy of the Asian Knowledge Hub on Sustainable Soil and Land Management for the Asian region that I'm briefly going to present to you. So if you allow me just 1 second, I will share my screen and introduce you to the hub. Okay, I hope you're able to see my screen. So as I mentioned, this will be a brief introduction to the Asian Knowledge Hub on Sustainable Soil and Land Management. Let me start by telling you why we established this hub that is hosted by the FAO Office for Asia and the Pacific. Well, the objective of the hubs are that of facilitating the exchange of knowledge and experiences on sustainable soil and land management in the Asian region, enhance the capacity of individuals and organizations in implementing sustainable soil and land management practices, facilitate the identification of knowledge and technology gaps that can boost research and development activities, encourage the adoption of proven methods while inspiring innovation in sustainable soil and land management, and not last, to support project formulation and implementation activities. Because of this, we see the hub as a driver for positive change in agricultural and environmental practices. And the way the hub is established, it's basically like a knowledge hub, as it say the word, that reports and describes countries' original engagements to assess, monitor, preserve, restore, or enhance soil health over time, as well as United Nations contributions to the topic. In other terms, this means that the hubs compiles a list of equipment, online application, certification system, training systems, awareness raising systems, and much more developed by countries in the region and by UN offices. Information were collected using a participatory approach that involved the public sector, non-profit sector, academic and research institutions, as well as intergovernmental organizations. However, the hub is meant to support the work of a large range of stakeholders that go beyond the ones that contributed to the hub, and therefore it includes policymakers, local communities, the private sector, and the research and academia. The hub currently, the website hosting the hub is currently under development. However, FAO has a collaboration with the Center of Excellence for Soil Research in Asia, which is hosted by the government of Thailand. And therefore, the recording of the webinars organized under the umbrella of the hub are hosted on the CESRA website. As I mentioned before, the hub is an open access live tool. Therefore, if you feel inspired by what you are seeing today, or you feel like sharing the tools that you developed within your office, your organization or institution, please feel free to reach out for me, and I will be more than happy that have your work included in the hub. Just for your information, the hub has information organized into 5 categories, depending on their core scope, so that we have tools serving soil assessment, monitoring, and mapping purposes, other tools falling under policy, then investment, field activities, and last, we also look at tools that can support communication efforts. Today's webinar is organized under scope 2 of the Knowledge Hub, which is on policy. And its objectives are to highlight the importance of land tenure for soil health, assess the status of land tenure in Asia, and not last to discuss the development of strategies that integrate land tenure and sustainable soil management for the better achievement of national land degradation neutrality targets. With this, I finish the presentation and the introduction to the hub. And as we said that the webinar is meant to be interactive, so please feel free to take the floor at any time and make your intervention or statement. We would like to break the ice with a small exercise. I will share my screen again because I have a number of polls for you to ask you. But I also have I would like to ask you the first question in the following format. I hope you know Mentimeter. If not, this is a good opportunity to learn about it. So I would like to ask you to scan with your phone this QR code, or otherwise to click on the link on screen. I also put it in the chat box of the webinar, so you can easily click on it. And therefore, by doing so, I would like to ask you, what associations or thoughts come to your mind when you hear the term land tenure? What is land tenure to you? How would you define it? Again, please scan the QR code that you see on screen with your phone and type the answer, or click on the link and tell us your opinion on what land tenure means to you. Please let me know if you have any issue using this tool, as otherwise we will launch a poll. Okay, let me start sharing the results. This is how your inputs will show. So land tenure to some of you relates to indigenous people, to others relates to the ownership and rights of the land users. What else? If we talk about land tenure, what comes to your mind? As you can see, answers are anonymous, so don't feel shy. Nothing else? Well, I think we are getting close to the answer that will be provided through the first presentation in the agenda. Okay, another reply. We respect to land and land-based the ownership and relationships. Ownership of the farmers or aboriginal of the land in recorded personal assistance. Let me keep it open for a little while more. Very interesting answers. Anything else? Okay, land tenure is occupied by some of artificial areas. This is a question. Maybe our experts can answer it later on. I kindly ask them to take note of these answers so they can eventually touch on them during their intervention. Okay, I'm closing it here. And I will move to the next question that I have for you today. This will be in the form of a poll. Pause here. Okay. So the question is the following. Looking at agricultural land only, Do you think that land tenure has an impact on soil health and the practice of sustainable soil management, or even the practice of soil management in general? Yes, no, or you don't know? Looking at agricultural land only, do you think that land tenure has an impact on soil health and the practice of sustainable soil management? I will close the poll shortly, so please hurry to answer the question. Yes, no, or you don't know. Okay, the majority of you said yes. And this is very good to know because it's among the scope of today's webinar. Let me ask you another question. The question is the following. We are getting a bit personal in here. Is land tenure a burning issue in your country based on the definition of land tenure that you have in mind? Yes, no, I don't know. Is it a burning issue? Please hurry to answer as I will close the poll shortly. Okay, so the majority of you said yes, and some other people said no, and it would be very interesting to know what countries we are referring to when the answer is no. This will really help us also maybe to target FAO actions accordingly, so we know what countries to prioritize when it comes to dealing with the topic. Another question for you. We have a few questions to break the ice today. Is land tenure too politically sensitive to touch in your country? Yes, no, I don't know. Is it too politically sensitive to touch in your country? Answers are anonymous, so don't worry, we will not share your answers with anyone. I will close the poll soon, so please hurry to answer. Okay, sharing the results now. Yes, unfortunately, land tenure is too politically sensitive to touch in some countries of the region. We have 3 more questions to ask you. The next question is the following. Do you think that land tenure is well regulated in your country? Again, options are yes, no, or you don't know. Is it well regulated? I will close the poll shortly, so please hurry to answer. Okay, the majority of you said no, but we would also like to hear later on during the discussion from those of you that said yes, that land tenure is well regulated in their country. If the colleagues that said yes, if they can kindly share their experience on land tenure and how this is regulated in their country later on in the discussion. It would be extremely interesting to know also for sharing experience. Next question. Does your work often engage with land tenure? Yes or no? Maybe it's out of the mandate of your office, or no, you maybe try to avoid it, or other. Does your work often engage with land tenure? Yes, no, it is out of the mandate of your office, or no, you try to avoid it, or you can also say other. Maybe there are other things that hamper you from engaging with land tenure. I'm closing the poll shortly. Okay. For most of you, land tenure is out of the mandate of your office. For others, you do work also on land tenure within your duties. Last question. The last one for breaking the ice. The following. Is land tenure impacting upon your work? Yes, no, or to some extent? Is land tenure impacting upon your work? I'm about to close the poll. Please hurry to answer. Okay. Okay. For the majority of you, land tenure impact to some extent on your work. For others, no. And the last, it does impact the work of some of you. Okay. Many thanks for starting to share your experience on the topic. Now, before we get into the presentations of today that will really open the discussion, we have a nice video to show you that will sort of start introducing us to the topic. So I will share my screen again. Please let me know if you can hear and see it well. And the video starts now. Don't worry, we will not watch it all, just 1 minute. And it's kindly borrowed by the USAID.
Tenure and natural resource management. Demographic growth and changing patterns of land use, linked in part to climate change, are placing pressures on natural resources around the world. As competition grows for a dwindling and often degraded resource base, resource tenure arrangements are rapidly evolving. USAID has long held that secure land tenure and resource rights contribute to improved biodiversity and sustainable natural resource management. Where these rights are poorly defined and/or poorly enforced, natural resources and ecosystems can be quickly degraded because incentives to protect resources are weak or absent. This insecurity can lead to overgrazing of rangeland, poaching of wildlife, deforestation, ineffective watershed management, and poorly planned extraction of mineral resources.
It's critical that you have secure and long-term property rights for people to have the incentive to use land and related resources in a sustainable, long-term way. If you don't have secure rights, you're less incentivized to use those resources for the long term.
There are two ways in which security of tenure contributes to the sustainable management and conservation of natural resources. When communities and individuals have property rights, they tend to invest in the protection and regeneration of natural resources. Devolving rights to people and communities and ensuring tenure security may lead to better resource management if communities receive sufficient economic incentives for their resource conservation efforts. Complex tenure arrangements operate in any given place. Through a process of dialogue and negotiation, governments, the private sector, and local communities can often create new rules and institutions to govern natural resources. This may contribute to improved resource management. Let's look at the case of decentralized natural resource management in the West African Sahel. In the 1980s, USAID supported reforms in forest and
Okay, we hope that you enjoyed the video. Sorry, we ended it before its actual end, but we cared of you listening to the first part of it especially. And again, we thanks the USAID for borrowing it to us. Now let's get into the presentations of today's that will break further the ice and really get us into the discussion. The first speaker of today is Mr. Daniel Hayward, Land Governance Specialist at the FAO Office for Asia and the Pacific, that will provide us with an overview of land tenure in Asia. So Mr. Hayward, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Lucrezia. Actually, I'll let everyone into a little secret that Lucrezia and I actually share the same office. So if I look this way, I'm looking at her. And I've in some past weeks, I've been half listening in on some of these really interesting webinars. So it's an absolute pleasure to be part of and contribute to one of these sessions. So really nice to meet you all. I've been entrusted with giving some information in land tenure in Asia. I have quite a bit of material, so I hope I don't overrun. But first of all, let me share my screen. And I should be sharing my PowerPoint without everyone seeing the notes. Yes, that looks good. So let me dive into the material. My aim today is to cover four areas. Basically, as a way to start, I think it's good for us to start opening our thinking about land. So I want to start challenging you to look at the complexity of land in its meaning and use. Through this entry point, we'll then look at some different forms of land tenure and link that to land tenure security. Then we will look at what the main manifestation of this work in FAO is through the voluntary guidelines for the governance of tenure. So I'd like to introduce you to FAO's position through these guidelines. And then to close off this presentation, I'll look at the case study, a recently completed project in Pakistan, the Improving Land Tenure in Sindh project. So moving into looking at the complexity of land. First of all, I'd like to consider the fact that land can mean many different things to many people. Now, in our accepting there's a range of people here in this session, I think most frequently in our work, we engage with land in two main ways. Firstly, we may consider it as an economic resource, and that can involve whether it's looking at agricultural systems, activating use of the soil, to subsoil resources, say from minerals, mining, to resources above the soil, whether that's forest or non-forest products, for example. We could also consider land as a financial commodity, as a form of property, but as a tradable commodity in itself, quite divorced from any specific characteristic of the land itself. The second area we most come up against, I would say, is land as an environmental resource. So this can be considering biodiversity, or land's ability to support biodiversity, or its ability to for carbon sequestration, for example, through forest lands. However, there are numerous other possible meanings with land. So, for example, we can also think of the historical context of land. Below, I give a photo of Angkor Wat in Cambodia as a sort of as a very specific kind of credible and long-lasting use of land that defines how that land is placed today. Land can have important political value. So, and in this sense, we maybe have to look at the power relations to that land, where we may be looking at state-society relations and the control of land-based resources. Finally, we can also think of social and cultural importance in land, whether we're looking at a sort of cultural and religious landscape, thinking of it in terms of the groups that are living on it and whose identity is partially formed by their relationship with that land. So we have a great variety here. And this is further complicated by the fact we may be looking at multiple different landscapes. So it could be from croplands to pasture lands, forests, built up urban land. And we can also think in terms of the resources on it, water resources. A third area of complexity is thinking in terms of all the different stakeholder interests on land. Now, I've put a sort of classic formation here in terms of state actors, civil society, and the private sector. But even within these groups, we'll have multiple variety. For example, we may have different state agencies who have certain interests on land, whether you're working for a Department of Agriculture or a Department of Forests, for example, that may have quite different perspectives on how the land should be controlled and used. For civil society, even within a community, there could be competing interests. Or, for example, you could think of the different perspectives of people who are, for example, living in rural areas compared to those who are living in urban areas. The private sector, you could think of in terms of domestic, international and multinational corporations. And often what we find in the Asia region actually is that there is a closely tied relationship between the private sector and state actors. And it was notable that we'd had a comment in the chat box at the outset of this session talking about sort of the potential power of the private sector to control how land is acquired and used. And in the case of this comment, linking it potentially to corruption as well. So these are all things we have to keep we're kind of juggling in our hands as we try to understand land and the relations we have with land. So on that basis, I'd like to consider what is land tenure. And I've included a quote here from FAO, which I'll read out. We can call land tenure the relationship, whether defined under formal de jure law or under customary law, that individuals and groups hold with respect to land. Land tenure rules define the ways in which property rights to land are allocated, transferred, used, or managed in a particular society. I'm going to build on this a little bit by going to this distinction between formal law and customary law. So we can think of, in thinking of access to land, we could think of two key forms of governments. There are more, but this is maybe a simple way of considering things. So in terms of formal recognition, which is generally codified through the writing down in laws and through acting upon through a formal administration, often split into private and state land ownership, but then there could also be the provision of land use rights. And I've put a diagram here on the right of the screen where we can think in terms of a bundle of rights. So often legal stipulations on land can involve a whole series of different rights to land. So individualized rights of ownership could include possession, exchange, use, the ability to inherit land, to subdivide it. And there may be also state-maintained rights, the ability to tax on the basis of land ownership, to appropriate it, to control how it is used. And land tenure security in this kind of formal system is often equated with the ability to have a whole series of rights collected together. And the more you have, the more secure your land may be. However, on the other hand, you can also think in terms of community or customary rules which operate at the local level. So these could be on the collective basis of a community, or they could also be individual, or you may even have a combination of both within a given locality. The rules on land could involve open access, which is commonly what we find in pastoral areas around the region. The rules may be written down, but they may also be passed down in unwritten oral form. We often encounter different systems whereby land may be matrilineal, passed down on the female side, or patrilineal, passed down on the male side. And here we have to be careful not to confuse how land is inherited next to who controls how land is used. So, which would be then talking about a matriarchal or a patriarchal system. So you could theoretically have a matrilineal system of land inheritance on the female side, but the decisions on land are still controlled by men. The final comment here I'd like to make is that there's often, I think, a mistaken view that customary land represents a sort of embedded static form, when in fact I think what we find is that customary systems are very dynamic and very reactive to the resource and population needs in the present day. On this basis of two different forms, I think it's worth taking a moment to consider the notion of land tenure security. Now, I already mentioned that you could say a whole collection of rights could create security. However, there are many conditions by which insecurity takes place. So it can be that having your land that is not recognized in a formal system can create insecurity because it's possible that the state could come and claim that land. And we find that throughout Asia, that there may be areas of land that are given protected status or claimed as, for example, forest reserve land, where there are still communities living within whose actual own rights are not formally recorded in statutory systems. Insecurity can also take place because there's a lack of protection against market forces. Now, that can be whether you are under customary land or within statutory system. It can happen on both sides. Even if there are laws to protect your rights, perhaps these laws are not enforced. And that can be particularly complicated where you have legal pluralism, for example, in Sri Lanka or other South Asian countries. There may be legal ambiguities, and we often find this particularly around the notion of land acquisition. To one extent, on the one hand, you can claim that no land is 100% secure, and there may always be conditions whereby there is a need for acquisition. However, when things are often framed in terms of acquiring in the public interest, there can be an ambiguity at work which potentially can lead to exploitation of the law. We've already mentioned competing interests by different stakeholders. There may also be land scarcity where, for example, the population growth pressures could increase scarcity. Also, population movements This also links to environmental shifts, which also ties into the impacts of climate change and the ability of, and we're starting actually to link here also to land degradation and soil management, whereby dwindling resources can threaten the sort of security to be on your land. And finally, it's also worth mentioning conflict, which can lead to conflict-derived migrations and people having to move away from their land without the certainty they'll be able to claim it back at a later moment. So there's lots, again, we're seeing complexity here, where there's lots of different components whereby land tenure can, insecurity and security can take place. A common question that has arisen around is whether we need to formalize or recognize customary land. And I've put a diagram here, which was produced in it's from a report in 2008, which very much promoted the idea that the way to secure land, and it's been a long time theory, is that we're looking towards a movement to bring land into formalized system, potentially have land titling, formalized land registration that changes the system, maybe being incorporated on through a customary land tenure. Now, there's very much lots of nuanced arguments here, but I think the landscape has changed, where there's much more interest in recognition of existing land tenure rather than trying to shift it. And it's worth observing that formalization of land, for example, in titling, does not necessarily guarantee tenure security. And it's also worth pointing out that if you create inclusion for one person over their land tenure, it also does mean that you will exclude someone else having access to that land. And this is known by the sort of the double-edged exclusion of land. At this point, I thought it would be useful just to consider, what does land tenure insecurity mean in terms of the work of FAO? And I just jotted down some areas that come up in the work we do through the Land Tenure Office, for example, at RAP. Having land tenure security can mean that it becomes difficult to identify the beneficiaries for an agricultural project or conservation project. And this is particularly problematic in the sense that we are looking to engage with the most vulnerable. We're looking to do no harm. Yet if there's a certain invisibility from not having a clear land status, we may end up doing the very opposite in a project. And that includes an ability to include potential vulnerable beneficiaries in activities. Land tenure insecurity may mean that there's a reduced chance of beneficiaries buying into project aims. And this came up in the video we saw a little earlier, because there's not the confidence to invest in your land for the future. Now, in conservation work that FAO is increasingly involved in, there could be, by shoring up the ability of, for example, protected forest areas to conserve their land, it may actually have an impact in the increased marginalization of people's living in these areas, in these forest areas. We'll come to our social standards framework in a moment, but there is a risk that project activities could end up in creating eviction, for example, where infrastructural needs for in certain activities result in the shifting of people. Then, should national disasters or an event take place during a project, reaching people may be tricky if they do not have clear land tenure or evidence of their land tenure. And this certainly has come up, for example, in recent in the Pakistan case study we'll be looking at a bit later, when we had, during the period of the project cycle, we had both the period of COVID-19 pandemic and also the 2023 floods in Pakistan. And finally, we've also discussed already a little bit about the fact that if there is land tenure security, you may end up with competing claims and conflicts, which can also kind of impede an FAO project. Now, I think at this point, these points on this next slide have already come up and they were already mentioned in the video earlier. So thinking a little more precisely in terms of how does tenure insecurity link to soil health and land management? Often this can result in short-term outlooks and how you manage your land. And there's various outcomes which could include overgrazing, deforestation, soil degradation, chemical use, a whole number of possible impacts. The willingness to invest in land we've mentioned a few times. And conversely, the willingness to apply sustainable land management practices, there may be a reticence to this. Finally, there can be potential linkages between tenure insecurity and land conversion practices, whether that is with the land users themselves or the ability of other actors to, in a way, to barge in on that usage and potentially take over the land, or land grabbing as we commonly know it. Very briefly, I'd like to mention FESM, which is the Framework for Environmental and Social Management from FAO. This was brought in or operationalized in June last year, 2023, and has at its core a series of 9 environmental and social standards by which all projects are measured to try and counter and avoid or mitigate against risks in the implementation of project activities. And I've highlighted ESS 7, which directly engages land tenure, displacement, and resettlement. And in particular, there is a very much a red line in FAO policy against its activities leading to the eviction of local land users, whether their tenure is recognized under formal law or under customary systems. So we have here a manifestation of the fact that we're looking beyond just statutory law, but we're also having a broader concept of tenure that has locally, socially legitimate tenure. Land also comes quite closely into other other standards, particularly ESS 8, Indigenous peoples. And to move towards the end of this part of the presentation, I'd like to just, if you haven't come across it, introduce the VGGT, which is, I'll read the whole title out. It's a little bit of a mouthful. It is the voluntary guidelines on the responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forests in the context of national food security. So this was endorsed by the Committee on World Food Security in 2012, with the aim to improve land governance and provide guidance and information on internationally accepted practices. I'm not going to go into detail here, but I've made a table on the contents of the VGGT, and you'll see there is a broad coverage from legal recognition of rights to transfer of rights, the administration of tenure, and responses to climate change and emergencies. There's 2 quick quotes I'd like to give that I think informs our session for today. The first comes from Section 3A, General Principles, and states that states should recognize and respect all legitimate tenure right holders and their rights, They should take reasonable measures to identify, record, and respect legitimate tenure right holders and their rights, whether formally recorded or not, to refrain from infringement of tenure rights or others, and to meet the duties associated with tenure rights. And I think the important thing here is really to show that we're dealing with recognition of tenure rights more than formalization. There's definitely a very particular kind of point of view being put forward here. Secondly, in section 3B, principles of implementation, I put this here referring to our connection to, say, soil and land management. Holistic and sustainable approach, recognizing that natural resources and their uses are interconnected, and adopting an integrated and sustainable approach to their administration. So in loose terms, there is a recognition that tenure rights closely link to sustainable land management. However, with the VGGT, we have this loose entry point. It's not going into much more detail than this, and therefore what we will see, I think, in the presentation of Aurélie that's coming up, is how VGT have now been connected to a much more to more considered approaches, namely in land degradation neutrality. So that's the end of the first part. How am I doing with time? I'm calling over to my colleague. Is it? Do you want me to continue with the case study, or shall I leave it for now? And how about we have this case study? How about as a case study for a project in Sindh, which you'll see on the screen? What I'm going to do is I won't go into many details, but we'll show a quick video to highlight how a project that tried to install informal land tenure certification to improve relationship between landlords and tenants in Pakistan, but connected to a wider package of agricultural activities to make a sort of an attractive package to the beneficiaries in the project. So I'll stop sharing my screen and then I'll reshare this video. Where is it? Here we are. Share this video, which is just 2 minutes, and this will complete my presentation. No audio? Okay, I know how this has happened. I need to tick a box for sharing sound. So let me try again. Share sound. It wasn't a difficult thing to do. Let's try again. Apologies for that, everyone.
असांजे ॻोठ में एफियो इदारो आयो त पोइ असांखे ख़बर पई त हारीअ जा हक़ कहिड़ा आहिनि। पोइ उन पंहिंजे माना हारीअ ज़मींदार जे विच में हिकु वाइदो थियो साल जो या 2 सालनि जो, जेतिरो बि माण्हू टाइम रखी सघे, त उन एग्रीमेंट कई। उन मुआदे जे विच में ॿ शाहिद बि ईंदा आहिनि, उन्हनि जी उहा लिखत थींदी आहे, उन्हनि जो उहो रिकॉर्ड हारी पाण वटि बि रखे पियो, त उनखे ख़बर पए त मुंहिंजा हक़ कहिड़ा आहिनि।
उन खां पोइ जेको असां इहो मुआइदो हिते पंहिंजे ॻोठ में मुतारिफ़ करायोसीं पंहिंजे हारनि खे ऐं पंहिंजा हार जेके मुंहिंजा हारी आहे उन्हनि त इहो कमु कयो पोइ जॾहिं उन्हनि हारनि मुंहिंजे हारीअ खे ॿियनि हारनि जो ॾिठो त उन्हनि जो त यार हे त ज़बरदस्त कमु आहे ऐं अहिड़ो मुआइदो असां बि पंहिंजे ज़मींदार खे चऊं त उहो करे ॾिए.
Okay, so I think with that, I'll wrap up my presentation. Thank you so much again for having the opportunity to speak today. And I'll hand back to Lucrezia.
Many thanks, Daniel, and apologize for putting pressure on you on time. I would like to ask you if you can please put the link to the video that you just showed in the chat box so that everybody can have a look at it in case they had some connectivity issue. And also, can I ask you to please have a look at the chat and also at the Q&A as participants are making some intervention on their specific experience on the topic so that during the discussion we can better articulate on their points. Now, my suggestion is that we move to the presentation of Aurélie, and we have a comprehensive discussion after it. So now I would like to present the next speaker of today, Ms. Aurélie Bress, Land and Water Officer at the FAO headquarters. And Ms. Bress will introduce us to the technical guide on the integration of the voluntary guidelines on responsible governance of tenure of land, fisheries, and forest, long title, in the context of national food security into the implementation of the United Nations Convention to combat the desertification and land degradation neutrality. Ms. Bress, the floor is yours. Thanks.
Thank you, Lucrezia. And like for Daniel, it's a real pleasure to be with you. I found the whole initiative excellent. And thank you for having invited me. I am very, very happy that we get this time to exchange together. I have a question for you. I would be super happy if you can interact in the chat. My first question would be, do you know the concept of land degradation neutrality? If you can just put in the chat, yes, no, that would be helpful for me to know if I need to present it or not. Daniel has already done a fantastic job into presenting a bit what is tenure. Okay, so I see some familiarity. Evangeline, Bazaradna. Okay, so I am with people that are maybe more familiar to the land degradation neutrality. So now, if you allow me, I will start sharing my screen and go through the presentation I prepared for today. You tell me if you see it well. Just see if I can into presentation mode. Is that okay? Are you seeing it in presentation mode?
Not in presentation mode. Now, yes. Perfect.
Ah, yes. Wait, so I did it. Here, it's still okay?
Yes, perfect.
Okay.
Thanks, Aurélie.
So I call it a deep dive into integrating tenure to land restoration or sustainable land management. Daniel has made a fantastic job now in bringing us to the complexity of tenure. And there are multiple layers. And we know that these multiple layers of complexity sometimes have provoked to try to stay away from tenure issue when we were handling with environmental issues such as sustainable land management. Yet it usually do not end up so well in some cases. So the work that I'm going to present now was actually trying to be really action-oriented and to try to give the key to the entry of tenure to think how tenure activity can be integrated also in sustainable land management, land restoration initiative, no? In a bit of a pragmatic way that helps to progressively address this layer of complexity that we have seen with Daniel. So just the onset of it is that, so in 2019, at the 14th Conference of the Party of the United Convention to combat desertification, United Nations Convention to combat desertification, the parties, so the representative of the countries, have negotiated and taken the decision 26, where they have recognized the importance of integrating the voluntary guidelines on tenure within the implementation of UNCCD to the achievement of land degradation neutrality. The reason for that has been that also in that same year, the Science and Policy Interface of the UNCCD had published a report showing that land governance was a fundamental aspect, amongst others, but a key aspect to support the enabling environment to achieve land degradation neutrality. So from there, we have started a collaborative joint work with UNCCD, us FAO as technical agency, to help to bring a bit together these two massive compendium, one on land degradation neutrality with this concept, the decision that have been linked to the Conference of Parties, and on the other side, also the voluntary guideline, the almost 10 years of implementation at that time of the voluntary guideline, what means the text, what has been negotiated by the party, by the countries, the civil society, private sector, and academia in the text of the voluntary guideline. So just here, and it's good so that you know the land degradation neutrality concept. So just to remind everyone, the land degradation neutrality concept basically try to balance the state of land, try to have throughout the time no degradation of land, which means that there is a balance exercise where some places where degradation will occur and may occur naturally or due to anthropologic reason, but also some other place where land get better. And the whole response hierarchy for land degradation neutrality is based on the fact of avoiding first land degradation, when land degradation occurs, reducing it, and when land is degraded, reversing it. Obviously, the latest is the hardest and the most costly to do. So that's why also the response get this pyramidal shape into most should be avoided. So that was just a bit to say what was the concept of land degradation neutrality. So with that in mind, in 2019, the party of UNCCD have asked FAO to collaborate with UNCCD to produce a technical guide to help disintegration of tenure, disintegration of the VGGT within the implementation of UNCCD. Alors, we could have written an immense book. There have been many publications on governance of tenure. Us as FAO, we've been developing series of technical guides actually to help in the various aspects that can be tackled on tenure. But we have chosen to do differently on this technical guide. We have tried to make it comprehensive entry point, meaning in the sense that to help readers that we were in that case, our audience was more policy decision makers, but also land administrators, potential beneficiaries, to have a place, a guide where they can enter and have a bit of all the topics gathered, further indication of reading, and suggestions of action each time at national and local level. so that this could help whenever there is either land degradation neutrality targets being developed or program or project initiative on land degradation neutrality that tenure may be considered in. The guide is built on 3 key considerations that are coming at the same time from the VGGT and from the COP's decision, the Conference of Parties decision of the UNCCD. The first one is we will be aiming at looking more at the legitimate tenure right, as was presented by Daniel. So meaning this first principle of the VGGT, which is recognize the legitimate tenure right and their right holders. So not only the rights that are as of now in the legal framework, but looking also at potentially rights that are not yet in the legal framework, but that would benefit from entering it. No, that are actually rights that are on the ground found, where people have social legitimacy to have those rights, no, and peacefully used. Second key consideration is the notion of consultation and participation. So the VGGT contains in the text one consideration whenever it applies for free, prior, and informed consent when it tackles indigenous people, for instance. So, and that is below the convention of the ILO 169, but goes beyond also by always inviting to have consultation and participation with the stakeholders. And in that, there is even a paragraph that evokes the notion of multi-stakeholders platform. And the third point is to have a gender-responsive approach. So you will see there is, and I will present it very soon, one specific pathway on that, but it's something that is across the technical guide we produce and the solution we are suggesting to always have a specific gender-responsive approach. So now I will present you a bit the way we have formulated that integration. We have formulated into 9 action-oriented pathways. And that the idea behind those pathways is that those are key aspects that are usually tackled when you have a land restoration project, or well, those are key aspects to look at on tenure. And we will see after a bit how we can organize the thoughts. It doesn't mean that in a given situation and in a given project, those 9 pathways are relevant. Maybe only a part of them are relevant. What I can already tell you is that the 4 that are on the left of your screen and that are with the white background are 4 pathways that we consider can always be useful, regardless of the LDN initiative, and I will come back to them. And then the 5 on the other side, on the green background, are those who are more context specific. So I will start by the 4 that can always be useful. The first one look at enhancing policy and legal frameworks. And that look at 1, this recognition of legitimate tenure rights. And second, looking at if between policy and legal framework that are on the sustainable land management side, let's say, and on the tenure side, there is no contradiction in between it. Sometimes recognition of a tenure right is linked to, for instance, deforestation. It is still existing in some legal framework. And so that is one to be taken. For instance, that would be one that is detrimental for sustainable land management. But then after it could go more in detail. The second one, look at having this multi-stakeholder platform, whether at national level or at local level, but also looks at how can cooperation, exchange of data can be improved in between the various sectors to help actually sustainable land management. The third one look at how to improve the security of women tenure rights and their access to land, whether at national or local level. And the fourth one, look at setting up accessible and transparent grievance and dispute resolution mechanism. This is important because also, as was presented by Daniel at some point, and it's something that is always through all these elements, a land restoration project aims at improving land, meaning that the value of land may change. Land may become more productive as a result of it, more valuable. So if in this panorama, some persons have weakest tenure right and non-recognized tenure right, they may be wiped out from their right at the moment that the value change, because the level of interest on land will change. So it's why these four pathways that are, as you see, interlinked, because for instance, the recognition of legitimate tenure rights is always advised to be done in correlation with the pathway 2, the coordination of multi-sector, of multiple actors, but also the pathway 3 and the pathway 4. Now I go to the context-specific pathway. The three latest ones, 7, 8, 9, are looking more at specific type of tenure regime in which we are. So for instance, if we are on public lands, on commons, or on private land. There was, for instance, the movie of Pakistan, no? The example of Pakistan was heading towards this pathway 9. How can rights, for instance, of tenants on private land can be strengthened? And then there is two other pathways that look more at one, how to ensure to have a tenure responsive integrated land use planning process. Land use planning is at the heart of a concept such as land degradation neutrality, no? Because it has this balance exercise that needs to be specialized also. And so depending on the scale, obviously, here can be integrated tenure. And there is another one that is more looking at when land administration tool or land management tools such as land consolidation and land banking can be used in order to improve the support to land degradation neutrality. How this get articulated? So here, we won't go too much into details, and I invite you to read the technical guide, but it's just to get the logic, no, of it. In this technical guide, what we advise on is always to start by having three types of assessment together. One looking at land tenure, one looking at gender, and one looking at biophysical assessment. Biophysical assessment is to understand what are the drivers of land degradation, and probably what are the drivers on land degradation depending on the land use. For instance, we are in a pastoralist context. Is there land degradation? Yes or no? What are the drivers of it? Is land tenure one of the drivers of it? Is gender equal access to tenure also could be considered as being among the drivers? How can we improve the fact that when we have a project, the investment on the project will be sustainable because we have dealt with whatever land tenure issue might be and durable. So that's the type of things that we will be looking into this three assessment. Depending of the type of initiative also, they can be done at various scale. And from there, looking a bit at what pathway could be of interest, and then going through this technical guide, you will see possible action every time at national, at local level that may be integrated into the initiative. So I will stop here for that part. And I will just go quickly presenting you, because this year is going to be a year of a COP again, of UNCCD. No, it will be in Riyadh in December. And so just to tell you that we've been presenting this technical guide at the COP15 in Abidjan in 2022. No, that's the part in the middle. And since then, with UNCCD, we have launched a joint initiative to support, to raise awareness and to support countries also that would be interested to integrate tenure into their land degradation neutrality and restoration initiative. So just to tell you that this joint initiative, we have built it with several partners. In 2023, we have been doing raising awareness efforts that have reached over 1,000 participants. Maybe some of you may have had the opportunity to participate. It was more or less 1 year ago. It was in May 2023. Then from there, we have also launched a call for application for countries that would be interested to hold national consultation or dialogue on how to integrate tenure into their LDN initiative. These were the response split by region, no, that we got. And I have to say that we've been very surprised by the level of response with the UNCCD colleague. Over 30 countries have responded, almost 30 countries, sorry. And I think that has shown a high interest from the country. It was not so much the use in LDN initiative to take on board tenure issue. And so the appetite that we have seen there is quite relevant, I think. 5 countries, due to budget allocation we were having for this initiative, are being supported. These are Kazakhstan, Kenya, Mexico, Senegal, and Sri Lanka for Asia region. And so just to give you a bit of an idea of what has been doing there, how does it work, those national consultation? It's like, in the case of Kazakhstan, so it's been done in 2023 in December. It's been convened by the Committee for Land Resource Management, which is also the UNCCD focal point in the country. It has been done building on various inputs from various projects, whether funded by JEF, funded by FAO or other partners, so that to bring the adequate information on tenure and on LDN to the participant, so that they could produce them through a methodology, a series of recommendations. And lately, these recommendations have been presented back to the Committee for Land Resource Management and other stakeholders for potentially seeing whether a specific tenure recommendation can be integrated into the National Action Plan on LDN that is currently being under preparation. Voilà, overall on that, the early lesson we have on this process is that what is absolutely key, and as always on tenure issue, is to have the conveners in the driver's seat, which in the case of this application to the joint initiative were either UNCCD focal point or link also with sometimes civil society, other also government institution, that to be useful, this national consultation need to have a strong mapping exercise of stakeholder project program and initiative, that potentially it's worth it when countries are very biodiverse or having several agroecological zones with different type, really very different type of land use. It may be worth to have a bit of zooming on these different agroecological zones as tenure issue linked to the land degradation drivers may be very context specific also. So it's worth to have this look. The effort should be on ensuring the sufficient level of information for tenure, LDN, and gender for all the participants that come to the national consultation, and to design a lot of methodologically group work to help processing the information and having some recommendation emerging. And a lot of synergy needs to be done when this type of work is being undertaken, so that to ensure that such a national consultation come into a longer process and serve longer objectives. And with that, I will close here my presentation. I'm afraid I must have been as talkative as Daniel. Attends,
It
pardon,
was perfect, Aurélie, don't worry. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was super interesting. And in this, there is already one question or statement in the Q&A for you. And maybe we can start from there. Maybe you can answer it live and we open the discussion. Now we have 10 minutes, more or less, even a bit more, to engage in discussion. And we also have some driving question. I will share my screen so I can put them on screen. And just to stimulate a bit colleagues in the call to share. These are some points of reflection or question that we can discuss in these 10 minutes. But again, I would like to invite everybody in this call to either to write or even better to raise your hand, and I will give you the floor. I will enable you to unmute yourself so you can make your statements live or even ask your questions live. Maybe I stop here and I pass it back to you, Aurélie, if you want to get back to the question.
Okay, I see. So the question is from Vishnu.
I think maybe it's India. So maybe let me read it loud.
So no, yes,
Okay.
yeah. Go ahead, read it loud.
Okay, I think it's from India. But Vishnu, please feel free to take the floor and even rebut to what Aurélie is about to tell you. So Nepal, okay. So he's saying that while we are in the position primarily in project implementation, not influencing policy, resolving local level tenure issues, so pathway 1 and 2 is out of their reach. In this situation, we may need to wait for longer, and by that time, our project intervention may face the land tenure issues. In that case, I think we need to follow context-specific pathways.
Okay. Alors, actually, I have a bit of, and it was why when we prepared the technical guide, we were very attentive to suggest action at both national and local level. So meaning sometime it is not feasible, as you are rightly mentioning, a project may not include in its work to draft a land policy, fair enough, or review a legal framework. Nevertheless, it may also be the opportunity to document and to try to push forward to have this information brought back at national level. So through policy brief and so on and so forth, and to look really also at, are there legitimate tenure rights that are not recognized? Are those non-recognized yet legitimate tenure rights impeding work? Even maybe, and that's also the case for the second pathway, no, that look at a local platform, multi-stakeholder platform that has been used in also several countries. We have been supporting them, and they have been able to generate local solution that can be aligned to the legal framework, but or that can help to actually respond part of the tenure insecurity that is there. I have the case in mind, for instance, of conflictivity in Colombia, in the national park areas, where through local platform, new agreements were reached to diminish that conflictivity while ensuring better tenure security. We have had also cases to dealing with tenure and security through local platform. So voilà, I would say that potentially there is room.
Many thanks, Aurélie. Vishnu, please feel free to take the floor if you want to intervene. I see Daniel wants to intervene. Daniel, please.
Shall I say it? Yeah. inspired by that question, I think I'd like to return to our polls at the beginning, actually. And a reminder, apologies, just knocked over a bottle. A reminder that 62% of us agreed that land tenure is a burning issue. However, 56% of us also said that it's too sensitive to handle. And I think this is a very telling telling observation, in that people working in land tenure office for FAO, you often come across the kind of attitude that, oh, this is land tenure, it's too hot, too hot to handle, it's too tricky, and people are often a little reticent to approach land tenure. Now, there's two observations here I'd like to give, which may not give in a way, the question around we cannot handle some of these pathways maybe relates to that. But there's two things I'd like to say. Number one, there's a reason why land tenure and land degradation have been linked together. That land degradation is not going to be solved unless we sort out the tenure issues connected to it. Number two, rather than maybe thinking in terms of, oh, it means we have to address land tenure, maybe this actually represents an opportunity, because where there may be sensitivities around tenure itself, there is definite interest in addressing these degradation issues. There are interests where it comes to the fact that productivity is maybe lower than it should be, and that can link to tenure. So there are these potential emerging or already existing entry points where we can address tenure. So we have, whilst we're linking degradation to tenure through this technical guide, through these initiatives, and we have to bear in mind we're at an early stage where this is an emerging body of work where we're learning how exactly we go about it. But there are going to be opportunities to approach this from different angles and start to consider, okay, maybe it's going to be complicated and sensitive in this direction. So let's go back on the okay, well, actually we want to engage, we want to stop this degradation, we want to keep fertile soils, we want to maintain them, stop them being converted. And we'll come back to the fact with governments, this means we really have to acknowledge, recognize, and sort out these tenure problems. So these are some thoughts around that question. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. And I see that Aurelie is replying to Fozia from Pakistan on her question in the Q&A. Aurelie, I don't know if you want to answer live or if you want to keep on typing.
So live, I was thanking you, Fozia, for the very interesting point. Absolutely crucial, and that is met by a lot of countries. It's actually very complex sometimes to control the use of land and to ensure that fertile land don't go to urban sprawl, to speculation, and so on. And a lot of countries are facing this issue. I would tend to believe that in this type of case, a first step is really raising awareness, documenting, potentially also costing, because land degradation has a cost, and that can raise the attention of government. So working along those lines can be interesting first steps. Maybe also finding champions at the beginning that can support further these elements. I'm quite sure you have all this issue in also all these possible answers now in mind, and I see your hand, so happy to hear you.
Thank you, Rolly, and thank you, Lucrezia, give me a floor. Actually, this is a very big problem. I was in FAO during the LTS project, in which Daniel, I think, also engaged. But I'm surprised again is that being a scientist, why we are not going to summarize the things through media, through documentation, as you mentioned. So I think we should take a decision or take a part in this regard, because land tenure is very important in this regard. And whenever I saw, I mean, during our meetings, we discussed on this, but there is no any documentation, there is no any implementation from the institutions and also from the government. But still, it is a biggest problem for the farmers as well. Because since 2019 to 2022, I was engaged in one of the SCIR project, in which I also conducted many critical analysis, institutional analysis, that how the project, any project is like institution work with the farmer. But why, again, they are the tenants, they are the absentee, there is no land holding groups are here. 1972 reforms of the Pakistan are still stuck. They are not revised again. So in this regard, Alwar and Daniel, you both are engaged in many of the projects in Pakistan as well. But again, I think we should start new projects followed by the last projects to discover implementing partners, to discover the policy, advocacy that must be implemented as well. So in this regard, what are your opinion? My question to you both, how we can suggest the farmers, how we can suggest the policy makers, advocacy makers, and the director generals, vice chancellors, who else are engaged with the agriculture and land policies makers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Fosia. I can't see Aurelie, but Aurelie, if you want to add anything to it, please let me know.
I was thinking that Daniel may be a better place because if I understood, it's a follow-up of a project that I've just got.
In a way, this. Thank you for the question. You really dig into the heart of things, and this is where you really kind of get into the complexity of this. That we're not dealing with a situation when there's just going to be one simple answer here, are we? And we really kind of need to dig into the specifics. So, for example, as you will know from the ILTS project, and one of the things that we didn't have time to discuss, but in Sindh province, for example, there is a legal framework by which there should be support for farmers, for farmers and tenant farmers, which sets out roles and responsibilities for landlords. There is a law, a provincial law that basically prohibits bonded labor. And in fact, the Tenancy Act is from 1950, but it's never been implemented. So what happens when you have the potential mechanisms by which you could engage with tenure systems, you can help protect when they're just not followed through. So this is, you have to understand these specifics. Is the law providing something? Is it being implemented? If not, what's the reality on the ground? So you really have to dive into these localities. Now, in the case of the ILTS, that tried to bring in some informal land tenure agreements, set up local informal institutions in order to at least start improving relationships and giving some security to tenants and theoretically start helping to improve productivity. And in this case, this could be a medium by which you could advocate for better engagement at the provincial level, provincial government level. Whether this project was enough to do it on its own is a question, and there's obviously a question for FAO. Does this mean that we would need to keep going? What's our next steps? How do we follow up? So with that, I know I'm not giving an answer, but what I'm doing is using this particular case, the project that you do already know, to outline that this is a specific line that could work, but that's not going to apply necessarily in other countries. And in fact, what we're trying to do at RAP for the Land Tenure Office is start to have some more specific engagement points on land tenure. So we've been doing some work in Timor-Leste at the moment, where we're trying to understand customary land and its relationship to maybe national interests in applying a titled system. So it's up to us to try and understand what is the sort of policy framework, how is that even working at ground level, and what are the sort of entry points that do fit in with our programming. It's a complex and ongoing kind of line of work. So I hope that at least gives you a sort of frame in how we're thinking about it a little bit. Aurélie, maybe you have something to add.
Yeah, actually, and I will link it also to the question of Marcus, which is about how long will be the normal time limit for the land tenure. And what about if tenants fails to get yield from the land due to natural disaster? There are many things in your question, actually, Fozia, and the case you raised forward, because also there is all the linkages. Why are these people selling their land? Probably because there is no social safety networks. So it's also where we see that tenure security doesn't come alone. Tenure security alone won't mean sustainable land management. It will have to come along with a bit of social security. For instance, that has been like if we take the past 20 years of land administration program, there have been massive land administration program, notably in Latin America. But what we see 10 years after they finished, land concentration restarts behind. Why? Because there was no social safety net. So when you are vulnerable, as soon you have a shock, if land is the only thing you have, that at some point is the choice of, do I keep that land or do I send my kids to the hospital? Right? That's the one. So saying that land get embedded in many things. So that was one element that I wanted to raise, and we know how complicated it is for some country to do have social safety nets. A second level of element, and that is where the link with Marcus will come, is like tenure is always a negotiation. And is always a negotiation that is embedded in a specific place or a specific country that depend on specific relationships that have evolved throughout the time and the history, and that are based on the use of land that is made. So for instance, on the question of Marcus, how long will be the normal time limit for the land tenure, which I understand, like, sorry, I will say I understand it, and then you tell me if I wrongly understood. It's like, how long can be, for instance, a contract for a tenant? Well, that would be extremely variable. For instance, in Pakistan, under the project, it was an improvement to get to a 1 to 2 year written contract. In some of the cases, for instance, let's take Guatemala. We used to have a project there where they were looking at introducing agroforestry. They were having a problem because usual tenancy was for 3 years. So they made a tripartite agreement with the municipality to get to 10 years. And so that was the breakthrough. to build sufficient trust to get to tenure so that they can put agroforestry. In some other places, it can be career long. So basically, you will be on that land as long as you can produce, and then when you cannot produce anymore, maybe even your child will be prioritary to get to that land. All type of organization can exist that really depend from the society, the culture, its history, where we are. And so then after, it's always gradual and modular. No, it's the step that can be reached. So that would be. Then after the question of dry harvest, again, it's all this thing, no, of the shock safety net that we were discussing around. I don't know what is the statute, for instance, of agriculture insurance in the case here in Asia, but this type of things. I stop here.
Thank you very much, Aurélie, and thank you very much, Daniel. I will get to close the webinar now because we are running 10 minutes late, but this is good because we still have all participants and the discussion has been ongoing, which means that it was very interesting for all to be here with us today. As mentioned in the chat a while ago, I will share at the end of the day the recording of the webinar, the presentations, and also the contact information of Aurélie and Daniel. So if you have any additional question or if you want to share more with them, you're free to do it offline, so by sending them an email. Once again, many thanks, Aurélie and Daniel. Before closing the webinar, I have 2 more questions to ask you. So you give us a feedback on how it went. First question is the following. Did this webinar change your perspective on land tenure? You remember at the beginning of the webinar, I asked you several questions on your perception of land tenure. So by attending it, did this perspective changed, or you still think the same on land tenure? I will close the poll shortly, so please hurry to answer yes or no. Okay, the majority said yes. Very good, because we hope that it changed for the better. Now, last question, and then I set you free. The question is the following. Would you consider land tenure in soil management projects? Yes or no? Or maybe, because maybe it doesn't depend on you. Would you consider land tenure in soil management projects? Yes, no, or maybe. Okay. Most of you said yes. Very good. Thank you. On behalf of soil. Thank you. Now with this, I'm closing the webinar for real this time. So once again, I thank you, Aurélie and Daniel, for talking to us today. Their presentation, I think, were very, very good. But I also thank you all for your active participation and therefore for your question and for sharing the experience from your country. Please do not hesitate to contact us in case of any question or need. As I said, I will send you all the related material after the webinar, and I wish you all a good rest of your day. See you at the next webinar. Thank you.